Days with Julian and Little Bunny by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Frank Blissett. August 8th, Friday. It was not much later than 6 when we got up. A pleasant morning, with a warm sun and clouds lumbering about, especially to the northward and eastward, the relics of yesterday's showeriness, and perhaps foreboding similar weather today. When we went for the milk, Mrs. Butler told me that she could not let us have any more butter at present, so that we must have recourse to Highwood. Before breakfast, the little man heard a cat mewing, and, on investigating, we found that the noise proceeded from the cistern. I removed a plank, and, sure enough, there seemed to be a cat swimming for her life in it. Mrs. Peters heard her last night, and probably she had been there 10 or 12 hours, paddling in that dismal hole. After many efforts to get her out, I at last let down a bucket, into which she made shift to scramble, and so I drew her out. The poor thing was almost exhausted, and could scarcely crawl, and no wonder, after such a night as she must have spent. We gave her some milk, of which she lapped a little. It was one of the kittens. Early in the forenoon came Deborah with Ellen to see Julian and Bunny. Julian was quite silent. Between 11 and 12 came Herman Melville and the 2 Dykinks in a barouche and pair. Melville had spoken, when he was here, of bringing these 2 expected guests of his to call on me, and I intended, should it be any wise practicable, to ask them to stay to dinner. But we had nothing whatever in the house today. It passed well enough, however, for they proposed a ride and a picnic, to which I readily consented. In the first place, however, I produced our only remaining bottle of Mr. Mansfield's champagne, after which we set out, taking Julian, of course. It was an admirable day, neither too cold nor too hot, with some little shadow of clouds, but no appearance of impending rain. We took the road over the mountain toward Hudson, and by came to a pleasant grove, where we alighted and arranged matters for our picnic. After all, I suspect they had considered the possibility, if not probability, of my giving them a dinner, for the repast was neither splendid nor particularly abundant, only some sandwiches and gingerbread. There was nothing whatever for Julian, except the gingerbread, for the bread which encased the sandwiches was buttered, and moreover had mustard on it. So I had to make the little man acquainted, for the first time in his life, with gingerbread, and he seemed to be greatly pleased until he had eaten a considerable quantity, when he began to discover that it was not quite the thing to make a meal of. However, his hunger was satisfied, and no harm done. Besides that, there were a few nuts and raisins at the bottom of the basket, whereof he ate and was contented. He enjoyed the ride and the whole thing exceedingly, and behaved like a man experienced in picnics. After talk about literature and other things, we set forth again, and resolved to go and visit the Shaker establishment at Hancock, which was but 2 or 3 miles off. I don't know what Julian expected to see. Some strange sort of quadruped or other, I suppose. At any rate, The term Shakers was evidently a subject of great puzzlement with him, and probably he was a little disappointed when I pointed out an old man in a gown and a gray, broad-brimmed hat as a Shaker. This old man was one of the fathers and rulers of the village, and under his guidance we visited the principal dwelling house in the village. It was a large brick edifice, with admirably convenient arrangements, and floors and walls of polished wood, and plaster as smooth as marble, and everything so neat that it was a pain and constraint to look at it, especially as it did not imply any real delicacy or moral purity in the occupants of the house. There were spit boxes, bearing no appearance of ever being used, it is true, at equal distances up and down the long and broad entries. The sleeping apartments of the two sexes had an entry between them, on one side of which hung the hats of the men, on the other the bonnets of the women. In each chamber were two particularly narrow beds, hardly wide enough for one sleeper, but in each of which, the old elder told us, two people slept. There was no bathing or washing conveniency in the chambers, but in the entry there was a sink and wash-bowl, where all their attempts at purification were to be performed. The fact shows that all their miserable pretense at cleanliness and neatness is the thinnest superficiality, and that the Shakers are and must needs be a filthy set. And then their utter and systematic lack of privacy, the close function of man with man, and superiority of one man over another. It is hateful and disgusting to think of, and the sooner the sect is extinct, the better, a consummation which, I am happy to hear, is thought to be not a great many years distant. In the great house we saw an old woman, a round, fat, cheerful little old sister, and two girls from 9 to 12 years old. These looked at us and at Julian with great curiosity, though slyly and with side glances. At the doors of other dwellings we saw women knitting or otherwise at work, and there seemed to be a kind of comfort among them, but of no higher kind than is enjoyed by their beasts of burden. Also, the women looked pale, and none of the men had a jolly aspect. They are certainly the most singular and bedeviled set of people that ever existed in a civilized land, and one of these days, when their sect and system shall have passed away, a history of the Shakers will be a very curious book. All through this outlandish village went our little man, hopping and dancing in excellent spirits. I think it was about 5 o'clock when we left the village. Lenox was probably 7 or 8 miles distant, but we mistook the road and went up hill and down, through unknown regions, over at least twice as much ground as there was any need. It was by far the most picturesque ride that I ever had in Berkshire. On one height, just before sunset, we had a view for miles and miles around, with the Catskills blue and far on the horizon. Then the road ran along the verge of a deep gulf, deep, 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 and filled with foliage of trees that could not reach halfway up to us. And on the other side of the chasm uprose a mountainous precipice. This continued for a good distance, and on the other side of the road there were occasional openings through the forest that showed the low country at the base of the mountain. If I could find the way, I should like to go back to this scene on foot, for I had no idea that there was such a region within a few miles of us. By and by we saw Monument Mountain and Rattlesnake Hill, and all the familiar features of our own landscape, except the lake, which, by some witchcraft that I cannot possibly explain to myself, had utterly vanished. It appeared as if we ought to see the lake, and our little red house, and Highwood, but none of these objects were discoverable, although the scene was certainly that of which they make a part. It was now after sunset, and we found that we were approaching the village of Lenox from the west, and must pass through it before reaching home. I got out at the post office and received, among other things, a letter from Phoebe. By the time we were out of the village, it was beyond twilight. Indeed, but for the full moon, it would have been quite dark. The little man behaved himself still like an old traveler, but sometimes he looked round at me from the front seat, where he sat between Herman Melville and Everett Dykink, and smiled at me with a peculiar expression, and put back his hand to touch me. It was a method of establishing a sympathy in what doubtless appeared to him the wildest and unprecedentedest series of adventures that had ever befallen mortal travelers. Anon we drew up at the little gate of the old red house. Now, with many doubts as to the result, but constrained by the necessity of the case, I had asked the party to take tea and rest the horses before returning to Pittsfield. I did not know but Mrs. Peters would absolutely refuse to cooperate at such an hour, and with such poor means as were at hand. However, she bestirred herself at once, like a colored angel as she is, and for my own part, I went over to Highwood, a humble petitioner for some loaf sugar, and for whatever else Mrs. Tappan should be pleased to bestow. She too showed herself angelically disposed, and gave me not only the sugar, but a pot of raspberry jam, and some little bread cakes, an inestimable gift, inasmuch as our own bread was sour. Immediately on our arrival, Julian had flung himself on the couch, without so much as taking off his hat, and fallen asleep. When I got back from Highwood, I found that Mrs. Peters had already given him his supper, and that he was munching his final piece of bread. So I undressed him, and asked him meanwhile whether he had had a good time. But the naughty little man said, "No," whereas, until within the last half-hour, never had he been happier in his life. But the bitter weariness had effaced the memory of all that enjoyment. I never saw such self-gratulation and contentment as that wherewith he stretched himself out in bed, and doubtless was asleep before I reached the foot of the stairs. In a little while more, Mrs. Peters had supper ready. No very splendid supper, but not nearly so meagre as it might have been. Tea, bread and butter, dropped eggs, little bread cakes, raspberry jam. And I truly thanked Heaven and Mrs. Peters that it was no worse. After tea we had some pleasant conversation, and at 10 o'clock the guests departed. I looked over one or two newspapers and went to bed before 11. It was a most beautiful night, with full, rich, cloudless moonlight, so that I would rather have ridden the 6 miles to Pittsfield than have gone to bed. That was 20 Days with Julian and Little Bunny, August 8th, 1851. By Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Frank Blissett.